as we officially launch into spring, and especially a delight to welcome Patricia Vasquez back to the Wilson Center. Since 2003, the high price for commodities in Latin America, minerals, oil, gas, agricultural products such as soy, are the principal explanation for the impressive growth rates throughout South America. Indeed, a recent report by the UN Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, known as CEPAL, reminds us that natural resources constitute fully 70% of the exports of South America. 70%, I think that's a pretty impressive figure. By the year 2013, the global investment in mining projects in the world was 10 times greater than it had been in the year 2000, and Latin America captured 30% of that investment. Known reserves of oil and gas have expanded in Latin America and the Caribbean since 2008 due to new exploration. So in a country such as Colombia or Bolivia, oil and natural gas exports now account for just under half of the total exports of that country. Oil and gas are 53% of Ecuador's total exports and fully 81% of Venezuela's. These figures are an important backdrop for today's discussion of Patricia Vasquez's wonderful new book, Oil Sparks in the Amazon. I have here my display copy, and you're all going to buy this when you leave. We'll have them for sale. But together with this boom has been a dramatic, huge increase in the number of conflicts related to new oil and gas projects. Why is that? Because in the three countries that are explored in Patricia's book, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, the oil and gas reserves, and hence the exploration and development, are located in remote areas of the Amazon, areas that are both ecologically fragile and inhabited by indigenous and farming communities. Issues of marginalization, culture, relationship to the land have all contributed to a volatile mix of grievances that have given rise to persistent and intense conflict, at times resulting in scores of people killed and wounded. Fortunately for all of us, Patricia, who has many years of experience in the energy sector, also identifies ways that these conflicts can be mitigated. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and I want Patricia to present her principal findings. There are copies of the bios out on the table. They will also be posted on the web. So I'll just briefly introduce our speakers. Patricia is an independent energy expert. She wrote this book largely while she was a Jennings Randolph Senior Fellow at the United States Institute of Peace. She currently resides in Nairobi, Kenya, but before that had worked for 10 years as the director, the head of the Latin America desk of energy intelligence. Chris Sabatini joins us from New York. Welcome. He is the Senior Director of Policy at the American Society and Council of the Americas and the founder and editor-in-chief of the magazine America's Quarterly, which we all have learned to love and know well. And the reason that he's here today is that he's done tremendous work on the whole issue of consulta previa, of prior consultation with local and indigenous communities, work some of which has been published already in America's Quarterly, and I think will be the principal lead issue in the next edition of the magazine. Following Chris will be our own Roger Mark D'Souza, who is the director of the Population, Environmental Security, and Resilience Program here at the Wilson Center. He focuses on issues of climate change, reproductive and maternal health, environmental security, and sustainable livelihoods. Roger Mark comes to the Wilson Center with a huge amount of experience in the NGO sector and in advocacy, and was also Director of Foundation and Corporate Relations at the Sierra Club. And finally, we have Bob McGuire, who's the Director of the Latin American and Hemispheric Studies Program at George Washington University's Elliott School. Most of us know Bob for his years of work on Haiti, but he and Patricia actually met when he was teaching a course at GW on the oil sector. He's a former Peace Corps volunteer and someone who worked at the Inter-American Foundation and, again, has done tremendous work throughout Haiti and the English-speaking Caribbean. So without further ado, Patricia, thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much to the Wilson Center for inviting me here, and to Cindy in particular, and to all of you for being here today. I'm not sure how to put my presentation up there.
We will, let's see.
What am I supposed to do?
Come, we're gonna, okay.
It was there.
Help is on the way.
Okay.
Help is on the way.
So, while this happens, I want to start by saying that my book is not intended to be a new theory of conflict. What I tried to do, rather, is to get a better understanding of these local oil and gas conflicts that have been developing in Latin America for the past 15 or 20 years. I have been working in oil and gas issues, thank you, during that time, and I saw that these conflicts were multiplying, and that they were multiplying very fast. And back then, conflict theorists were more focused on trying to understand the mismanagement of oil resources in what later became known as the resource curse, and this was mainly in oil-producing countries of Africa. But the local conflicts that I looked at are very different from those, because those were linked to armed conflicts, to civil wars. The conflicts that I look at are getting developed in the local producing area, and the most important thing is that they have a very important potential of becoming destabilizing forces for the country, as we will see. What I tried to do in this book is to try to study the root causes of these local conflicts and try to get an idea of the dynamics of the conflicts, and then also try to provide some ideas on how they could be mitigated. And I hope that these are going to be the main contributions of my book. So it was, it's this one. It was at the beginning of in the middle of the 2000 decade that we started to see the international press picking up on violent uprisings and marches in the producing areas of Latin America, especially the three countries that I looked at, Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia. These were confrontations or in that case, the armed forces trying to contain a group of violent demonstrators that were opposing the granting of oil licenses. Now, conflicts over natural resources are not new to Latin America, and we can talk very quickly of three categories. Geopolitical conflicts, for example, the era of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, when he tried to use the oil wealth of his country to make ideological and political alliances. Border conflicts, there's many examples of them. Bolivia and Paraguay in 1932 went to war over access to the Chaco Boreal, which was thought to contain oil, but it didn't. Revenue sharing, of course. Bolivia, for example, with its natural gas, when it discovered natural gas, the southern producing departments of natural gas tried to separate from the rest of the country because they were afraid of losing control of the revenues. And then there's the local conflicts, and these are the ones that I will be talking about for the rest of the presentation, and the ones that my book focuses on. These are conflicts that are geographically limited, and they develop in the area of the oil or gas producing area, but they may have an important national impact. They also involve, more often than not, indigenous populations or farming communities living there, and they're usually ignited by past grievances that have been unresolved for these populations living there. The book has three main messages. One is that these local conflicts should be looked at in the context where they occur, because there are historical grievances that have an effect on the conflict. There are cultural characteristics of the groups living in the area that may also have an effect of the conflict. And this is particularly true, this local context importance in understanding these conflicts when we're talking about indigenous populations. The second message of my book is that a strong political commitment is required to be able to solve these conflicts, even to address them. These are issues that touch upon very sensitive issues for the governments. They touch upon inequalities, that touch upon the marginalization, historical marginalization of some of these communities that now need to be brought in to be able to find solutions to the conflict. So, and then the third message of the book is that, of course, strong institutions are key for reducing the intensity of the conflicts. And I will talk a little bit about the role of the Peruvian ombudsman in trying to, in having a relatively positive participation in trying to bring down the intensity of the conflicts. The methodology that I used for the book, to explain it quickly, is I took 55 conflicts from Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia that happened between 1992 and 2010. I did a systematic and very detailed examination of each step of the conflict. Some of these conflicts went on for 2 decades. So I did a very precise examination of the dynamics of the conflict, how the stakeholders reacted to issues, what their interventions were, what was the local context at that moment, what was the cultural effect of the specific populations living in the area where the oil conflict was taking place. Then what I did is I graded the intensity of the conflicts on a scale from 0 to 5, 0 being no conflict, 5 being violent conflict, and then I compared them. I compared the conflicts, I came up with preliminary conclusions that I then tested on the field and with primary and secondary sources. Just to give a little bit of a global context in which these local conflicts were happening, it was a time of very high oil prices, it was a time of increasing demand for oil, especially from China. It was a time of less available conventional oil and gas reserves around the world, and also turmoil in the Middle East. What this context did was it turned areas that before had been risky or difficult or not economically viable to explore, it turned them into a good area to come in for investors. And this is how investors started to come into the Western Amazon. This chart shows how oil activity increased between 2004 and 2011 in the 3 countries that I mentioned. And this is measured by the numbers of wells that were drilled during that time. And in fact, it was oil from the Amazon that turned Ecuador into Latin America's 5th largest oil producer. And it was natural gas from the Amazon that turned Peru into South America's 1st exporter of liquefied natural gas. In the case of Colombia, it's a little bit of a different story because the historical oil production of Colombia came from different areas, not from the Amazon. It came from the eastern part of the country and the north in the case of natural gas. However, the new expanding licensees are going into the Amazon and also a little bit in the north of the country. Now, the Amazon became a very interesting and economically attractive area to invest in. However, it is obviously a very challenging place. It presents a unique environmental diversity. It presents lack of infrastructure for access. So sometimes what happens is that oil companies have to build roads into the Amazon, or they use the local rivers to carry their equipment, and this causes a lot of issues with pollution, with accidents with the local population. So this creates a lot of conflict. And then, of course, there's large numbers of indigenous populations that have their own culture and that are protected now by international laws, and which have populations that have had a history of marginalization and inequalities, and they have a lot of grievances. A quick chart showing the percentage of poor by ethnic groups shows that, for example, in 2001 in Peru, 82% of the indigenous population was considered to be poor, compared to 50% among non-indigenous. That improved in 2009 at the top of that same Peru graph. However, the proportions were still very different. In 2009, 56% of the indigenous population was poor, and 30% of non-indigenous were not poor. So the differences are still there. And of course, increased oil and gas developments in areas inhabited by indigenous populations that are economically underprivileged, that are marginalized, whose land tenure status has historically not been clear, has proved an inevitable recipe for conflict. Peru is a good example of this because it saw a very fast growing in the number of oil contracts, and at the same time, a very fast growing in the number of socio-environmental conflicts. When I say socio-environmental conflicts, that includes oil and gas conflicts in that same group. So if you look at this chart between 2004 and 2011, the number of oil contracts rose by 3 times, and at the peak of those contracts, of the number of those contracts in 2009, they had 89. There was also a peak in the number of socio-environmental conflicts of 123. By the way, the measurement for socio-environmental conflicts, it starts in 2008 because that's when official figures started to be published, and that's why I use that. So that to show that there is almost a parallel relationship between the increase in the number of conflicts and the increase in the number of contracts. So I looked at the triggers of these, the potential triggers of these conflicts, and I divided them up in 2 groups: structural flaws and transient conflict triggers. The structural flaws are those flaws that are embedded in the democratic system, if you will, and they're very difficult to solve because they've been there for decades and decades. The transient conflicts are more transitory, and they usually are related to the behavior of stakeholders. So it will be easier by changing a bit a behavior to improve the conflict. So just to focus a little bit on the structural flaws of conflicts that may, the structural flaws in the system that may trigger conflict, I'm going to talk about two sets of these. Poor subnational governance weaknesses that in the governance that may lead to conflict at the subnational level, and also problems with the legal framework that may lead to conflict. In the first case, I will give 4 examples. For example, an asymmetrical distribution of oil revenues may definitely lead to conflict. And this happened in Peru in 2008, where the governments of the producing areas of Loreto, there at the top in blue, were receiving 40% of the oil revenues. Now, Loreto is the #1 producing area in Peru. In comparison, Piura, which produces much less, the governments of Piura were receiving, the local producing areas were receiving 70% of the oil revenues. This was because the criteria that was used for defining the allocation of the oil revenues according to the canon law, which defines this allocation, was different in the 2 areas. So while Piura was basing its distribution formula on a percentage of the value of the production of the oil, Loreto was basing it on a percentage of the rents. And this caused major differences, and this caused huge violent demonstrations by the people in Loreto who were not happy because they were the #1 producing area, and all of a sudden they were getting less of the revenues. At one point, the production of oil in that #1 producing area in Peru was stopped for several weeks due to this problem. Another subnational weakness that may, how am I doing this? Here. Okay, another subnational weakness that may also lead to conflicts is related to the marginalization of the populations that, like I mentioned before, that live around the producing area. So here, again in Peru, the natural gas is produced in the Amazon, and it's shipped to the coast for export. Well, it turns out that in 2010, when Peru became an LNG exporter, the government announced this with much fanfare, and they had a right to, it was a big thing for Peru. It meant a big change. However, the local population, the communities that were living around the producing area in La Convención, they were still using wood for cooking, because the extension of the oil pipelines had not been done to their communities because it was not economically feasible. So this led to huge bloody protests, and these people were opposing to the exports of LNG, and they even held marches and demonstrations to the capital city of Lima because of this. So that was a major source of conflict. Thirdly, and I'll go quickly through this, is of course revenue distribution inefficiencies that have to do with lack of capacity of the local government to handle the new resources, and this may lead to conflict, corruption and clientelism, and also arbitrary investment decisions at the local level. Sometimes there isn't a predefined mechanism for defining the development priorities in the regions that should be funded with the oil or gas revenues. And if this doesn't exist, sometimes decisions for investments are taken in an arbitrary way. I went to a place where they had a great soccer stadium. I mean, it could have been in New York, but they didn't have drinking water. The communities didn't have drinking water. So this creates a lot of tension in the area, and it did. Lastly, the last example of poor subnational weakness that may lead to conflict is the lack of communications between the central government and the producing area. And this is very typical. The oil licenses are given in the capital city, and the local government learns about this new development once the company arrives in the company of a government official. This creates, of course, much frustration because the local government is not prepared to deal with these new licenses. On the part of the communities, whenever there is a problem or an issue, the communities indefinitely demand the presence of the local government. They want the central government to be accountable for their grievances. And when the central government is absent, this creates much tension and demonstrations, and sometimes the communities take up the producing areas until someone from the local government arrives there to take care of their problem. Another important source of conflict is when companies take the role of these absent governments in providing in developing the development agenda of the area. So the company makes an arrangement with the local community to build a school or to build a hospital. This in the long run is not sustainable because that school normally doesn't have the teachers to teach or doesn't have the notebooks to teach. Also, the communities may not feel that that's representative of what they really want because they haven't developed an investment, a prioritized investment agenda for what they want in the region. It's just an arrangement with the company. And then, of course, the company is there for 20, 30, 40 years, one day it leaves, so it creates a paternalistic relationship that is not sustainable. Then I said that among the structural flaws that cause conflicts, or that may lead to trigger conflicts, there's also some issues with the legal framework. The laws that are sometimes overlapping or confusing, or sometimes there isn't enough capacity to implement them. And then there is what Guillaume Fontaine calls the schizophrenia of the state, which is this confusing policy that calls for protecting some environmentally or socially rich areas, so protecting them by turning them into protected areas, but at the same time allowing for the development of oil projects within those areas. So what happens is that the borders of those areas are constantly changing for accommodating the oil. And there are two well-known examples with the Yasuní National Park in Ecuador, and also with the Uwa indigenous population in Colombia, which is probably the longest conflict that this community has had with regards to the Gibraltar 1 well, oil well, that is within their protected area sometimes, but then when the border moves is outside of their protected area. So much for the schizophrenia. Then the concept of national interest, when we talk about legal issues that are a little controversial, is very controversial. So when the government comes in and declares that an area that has oil resources is of national interest, that turns all other laws and regulations for protecting the environment and the local communities void. So that goes a bit against the concept of minority and indigenous populations' right that is in the constitutions of these countries. So that creates a lot of confusion and a lot of conflicts. The same thing with the concept of the government as the owner of the subsoil resources, which is in the constitutions of the three countries and of all of Latin America for that matter. This creates a lot of confusion with those people that own rights to the land on the surface, or like indigenous populations who live in community areas that maybe they don't own a land title, but they have been there forever and they feel that they have a right to stay there. So this creates a lot of confusion. Finally, the concept of free, prior, and informed consent. It's probably the subject that creates the most passionate disputes in the three countries. And I have seen this time and again in all the case studies that I looked at. This calls, free, prior, and informed consent, calls for the right of indigenous populations to be consulted prior to the development of the oil or gas project. But the three countries went even further than, this is part of the ILO Convention 169, which is binding, and the three countries signed it. But the three countries went even further than that. Peru passed a consultation law. Ecuador included consultation in its constitution. Colombia had the Constitutional Tribunal in Colombia ratified the right to consultation in several rulings. But still, disputes around consultation arise because of differences in the interpretation of the definition of the consultation, of the quality of the consultation, and of the timing of when the consultation can be done. I'm sure we'll talk a little more later on this issue. On the transient conflicts, like I said, these normally involve stakeholders, and it would take they're transient because they're easier to solve. It could take a bit of a change in attitudes, for example, to solve it. So, for example, in the case of the organizations that are active in the areas where the production takes place, there is a difference between organizations that are more cohesive and those that are more polarized. Usually those that are more polarized, they tend to have more conflicts between them that, of course, prevent them from expanding their advocacy action and creates a lot of confusion in the local community. This happened in Peru, and it was a bit of a contrast with the Ecuadorian civil society when at the end of the 1990s, beginning of the 2000s, they were very cohesive and they made very, very strong gains, like the inclusion of multiculturalism and consultation in the constitution. After that, the cohesion broke a bit. Then, of course, another issue that may lead to conflicts is the extent and the nature of the civil society that is there. When there are international NGOs active in the area, what happens a lot is that the grassroots organizations, they compete for the economic support of the international NGOs, but also because they feel that by being close to the international NGO, they will get more exposure. So this creates competition that ultimately leads to conflict, and it breaks a little bit the advocacy work that they're trying to do. The same thing if there are combative or what I call combative or conciliatory NGOs. Sometimes combative NGOs have, for example, environmental agendas. And I've heard many, many times communities telling me that those environmental agendas don't necessarily represent what they want. And this creates a lot of conflicts. These combative NGOs sometimes, most of the times, they reject outwardly oil projects. But sometimes communities, or some communities within the area, maybe not all of them, they want the oil project because they want the jobs. And so sometimes this creates a lot of tension and a lot of conflict. The availability, we know that the presence of good institutional mediation is positive for preventing conflict. So we know the opposite, that when there's weak institutions, this leads to conflict. During my research, I discovered that the work of the Peruvian ombudsman was an example of a relatively positive institutional mediation in conflicts. I say relative because the role of the ombudsman is not to solve conflicts. In fact, the ombudsman does not solve conflicts. The role of the ombudsman, the mandate of the ombudsman, is to protect constitutional and fundamental rights of the citizens. However, in practice, the ombudsman appears to be the only institution that has managed to bring, to forge a dialogue, if you will, among stakeholders, to bring the stakeholders to a negotiating table when the conflict reaches a very high intensity. And more than half of the cases that I looked at in Peru had had the intervention of the ombudsman. Again, this doesn't mean that the ombudsman solved the conflict. It means that it's a credible institution, and these are the characteristics of the reasons why the ombudsman seems to be relatively effective. It has a high degree of legitimacy. It has an agile structure, so representatives from the office of the ombudsman go to the people and they can take claims verbally and for free, which is important in an area where most people are illiterate or they don't have the money to travel to the capital city. So this is to make a claim. So this is very important. It also has immunity from prosecution, and it may present cases through the Constitutional Court, which is the highest court in Peru, directly, but also in the Inter-American judicial system, which, as I'm sure many of you know, has been instrumental in defending the rights of indigenous populations. And there are three main cases that help to do that. The Aguastingue case in Nicaragua, where the Inter-American Court recognized the right to collective ownership for indigenous populations for the first time. Then a second case, the Saramacca in Suriname, where the court said that the populations needed to be consulted before the development of industrial projects. So the court included the free, prior, and informed consent. And the last case, the Sarayaku in Ecuador, where the court recognized that some of these oil projects had indeed affected the cultural heritage of these communities. So these were groundbreaking cases. And finally, another example of a transient conflict that may trigger, a transient issue that may trigger conflicts is how oil companies operate. There's no doubt, as this graph shows, that social investments by companies, especially the big companies, has been increasing in the past 2 decades or a decade and a half. However, sometimes these are the major companies that have put a lot of funds into improving their corporate social responsibility. But sometimes there are smaller companies that come in, and sometimes they come in for a short period of time, and sometimes they don't have as much resources to devote to corporate social responsibility. Or sometimes they don't have stakeholders looking at them, and there's not an issue of image. So the kind of company that is active at the producing area at one time, that makes a difference in the development of the conflict, the kind of conflict that will develop, and if there is going to be a conflict. And I think that's it for today. Thank you. Great.
Wonderful, thank you. Chris?
Sure. Do I have to turn this on, or is it on automatically?
It's on.
Okay. First of all, I'm going to give some extemporaneous remarks, because Patricia, of course, did the best job of covering her book, so I'm not going to cover the book, but talk a little bit about one narrow element that she touches on, but is obviously important to me because we're doing research on it, which is consulta previa. But first, let me say thank you for the invitation, and I'm excited to be part of this project because it's an amazing book. It's a very, very good book in that it's systematic, it's thorough, it's very balanced. It does not try to assign blame, which is very rare in this, as you discovered. Everyone's always, it's the companies, it's the government, it's the communities. It is just simply trying to pick apart these very complex relationships and these trends and trying to understand them, and then trying to, at the end, trying to assign certain values, if you will, to their importance on sort of to conflict and the resolution of these conflicts. So it's an excellent book. And as Patricia said too, this is a new topic, and I may be guilty of a little bit of solipsism because I too am working on this, but I think this is one of the most defining issues in social, economic, and political development in the region right now, and potentially even in inter-American relations. Because if this isn't, and there's clearly, as Patricia said and as Cindy said, there's rising demand for resources, not just hydrocarbons, but also copper, timber, all these things and investments coming in, and governments are trying, in fact, governments are increasingly, whether it's Peru, Chile, Brazil, are tying their ability to address poverty and social needs to their ability to attract and maintain investment, at the same time that a lot of these communities are beginning to push back for reasons of self-identity, for reasons of international conventions, for reasons also of a sense of that this is their time. And so the potential of this to really reshape politics and economics is tremendous. And it's, this is, I think, a new generation issue that hopefully will take us a little beyond that old issue of resource curses and so on, which gets a little bit too macro and boring for my taste. What I'm going to talk specifically about is the issue of consulta previa, because she touches on it, and it's something we've been working on in the cases of Chile, Colombia, Peru, and Guatemala. And Patricia touches on all the different issues that affect the potential of conflict. And one of them, of course, is governance at a local level. One of the things you also mentioned was the distribution of revenue. To give one example, this one city, town actually in Ancash, San Marcos, received $60 million in 1 year. They have, because of that now, they don't have potable water, but they do have an Olympic-sized swimming pool, which isn't filled. They have a Plaza de Toros, and they have two mayors who have both been drummed out of office because of corruption. I mean, again, there's a lot of blame to go around in all this, so we need to understand. But the problem now, what's happened with consulta previa, and I believe this, as I was saying to Eric Olson before, this may be heresy, given that I work in an organization that represents, includes a number of business members, but I think consulta previa has to work because governments have signed on. It's become law in many places. Peru, Chile, Guatemala, Colombia have all signed on in various, and actually in 2008, Chile signed on. They issued regulations in 2009, and now they're actually refining the regulations. And it's led to an increase in expectations of community groups, but it's also scared the bejesus out of a lot of companies. Excuse my language. If I get too technical here, please tell me. And it was funny, I was in a panel in Colombia, and you talk to private equity investors, they're saying, we're not going to do anything that involves consulta previa right now. We're going to halt. But this is clearly untenable. It's law. The question is how can these governments sort of bring this to bear and affect it? And it's not an easy task. The upcoming issue of America's Quarterly, we sort of outline the different steps in consulta previa, and it's clearly a jumble of steps that only invests governments with a modicum of power and authority to do it. So if you're in Chile, for example, you go to the environmental ministry to start your consulta previa process. If you're in Colombia, they've created a office of the consulta previa, which is in the Interior Ministry, and they actually do all the consulta previa processes for you. If you're in Peru, there's a sub-minister, vice minister in the cultural ministry that does all your consulta previa. Now, what's interesting about the environment and the culture ministry, these are not powerful ministries. They don't have much in terms of resources. They don't have much in terms of authority. They don't actually have a direct line to the president. So they're too often overruled by a president or the ministries of mines and energy that actually have negotiated directly with the company. So they're coming in a little bit after the fact. And then take the worst case, for a variety of reasons, is Guatemala, which signed on to the ILO 169, a consulta previa, and has never actually defined the regulations, the laws, the processes that vested any particular office with the authority. So community groups are now, understandably, taking matters in their own hands and conducting community consultations, which they basically take as a vote, which they hold without any sort of actual consultation of all the stakeholders, and then believe that that gives them a veto power over investment, which has created a tremendous conflict with investors. Because according to ILO 169, it only says that indigenous groups, or in the case of Colombia, they've included Afro-Colombian groups, have the right to be consulted when a particular project or decision or policy affects their cultural heritage. Doesn't say they have a veto power, doesn't say how it's going to be done, doesn't say where it's going to be done, doesn't even say how long it will take. So this is an incredibly fraught issue. And on top of that, it's also an incredibly difficult issue for a lot of these state governments, these national governments to undertake. As I say, it's vested in very weak authorities, often in the principal government. At the same time, Supreme Court or courts are weighing in on these cases and confounding the process even more. In the case of Chile, the Supreme Court overturned a case claiming that one group that was a downstream, this is a case of a mine, had not been consulted and said that the consulta previa process wasn't sufficient, so the private investor had to go back and do it all over again. In the case of Chile as well, as I mentioned, it's the environmental ministry that does this. Basically sort of taking what is an indigenous issue and putting it in, turning it into an environmental issue, which for many companies, mining companies, obviously in the case of Chile, I'm sure they would love to have oil and hydrocarbons as an issue for consulta previa, but it's mostly mining. For them, in many of those cases, they're simply checking it off as a measure of how they're going to impact the environment. And then last, I'll just say in the case of Peru, as you mentioned, the ombudsman has done a great job of tracking these conflicts, but it's, and indeed, oddly enough, it's Peru that's made the most progress in terms of defining and taking in these cases. There are currently 20 cases of consulta previa that are being considered by the Vice Minister of Cultural. But the issue here is who is defined as indigenous, another critical issue. Basically, the Culture Ministry and the Mining Ministry define those indigenous only in the Amazon area. So Ashanika, Shipiba, Quechua, Mijuana groups. Aymara and Quechua are not in basically what is largely the mining area. So again, opens up, so who has this right to consulta previa? And so in limiting it in that way, it's also opened up the capacity for even greater conflict. That's not to say, again, that ILO 169 is a disaster. In fact, I think many of these governments are locked into it, and companies have to come to expect this, but the problem is governments haven't defined it well. And I think that, I mean, I see this as a compliment to Patricia's excellent book, is really, I think, an issue that needs to be defined and worked on. And to just give you, because I'll just give you two data points and I'll close. At the same time that consulta previa regulations and laws are being discussed and debated in Peru and Chile, conflicts have risen dramatically. Since 2002, conflicts in Peru have risen 548%. This is over mining and oil and hydrocarbons. So that by 2012, there are 149 conflicts that were related directly to natural resource extraction. In Chile, the same thing has happened. In 2008, which is the last year we could get data, there were over 74 land-based conflicts related to, in most cases, timber and dam and hydroelectrical projects in the south, but also in the north. And this is happening very much in parallel to the consulta previa. And so it's, you talk to the communities, you see the hope, but you also see very legitimate questions on their part and on the part of companies about the objectivity, the effectiveness, and the political will of these governments to change it. So, I mean, I think this is, again, an excellent book and a great start, and I want to continue to maintain this discussion. So buy the book. It really is, and it's, as I say, it's a pleasure. It's actually, you wouldn't think something about mining, oil and conflict would be a good read, but it's actually a quick read. I mean, it's read in about a day, so congratulations. Thanks.
Thank you. Great. Dr. Mark?
So thank you very much, Cindy, and thank you, Christopher and Patricia, for those really good opening comments and sort of overview of the book. I'm originally from Trinidad and Tobago, which is in the Caribbean, oil-producing island, and I have noticed over time that there are increasing domestic conflicts within Trinidad tied to the oil industry. And what I've also noticed is that as a country, Trinidad, it's a small island, has been leveraging these issues for geopolitics within the region. And that's a little bit about what I would like to talk about this morning and sort of build on the introductory comments. And I think outside on the table, you have some summaries of some work that we have done with Jeff Colgan, a professor from American University, and a former Wilson Center scholar who just last year was looking at how oil might encourage conflict initiation by what he calls petro-states. And he defines petro-states as countries to which oil exports comprise 10% of gross domestic product or more. And he comes to, he really has two positions with regard to this issue. First, he contends that oil income could decrease domestic political risks by furnishing leaders with a certain amount of economic resources that they will use to avoid political accountability in the context of military failure. Thus, he ties into the question of resource curse and takes that to an international realm. Secondly, he also talks about countries avoiding wars out of concern that military conflict could disrupt oil exports. So it's a very interesting complement to what you have been looking at, Patricia. And I'd like to build on that a little bit more to talk about three elements. And I know, Christopher, you described this as macro and boring, but I still think it's important to have a good appreciation of the ways that natural resources affect conflict. So I do want to talk about that a little bit more. I also want to talk a little bit about the inverse relationship. What do we see in terms of conflict and natural resources and vice versa? What do we know about that relationship? And finally, to think about what are the possibilities in looking at these issues together in terms of peace building and how that is being seen elsewhere. And I'm very encouraged in talking to Patricia that she's looking at this also in Eastern Africa. So we have an opportunity to draw comparisons across regions. So I'm going to start by just saying a little bit about what we typically refer to in the literature as resource capture, which is just recognizing that there's a local abundance of valuable resources, which very often combine with poverty or lack of opportunity for other groups in terms of livelihood and income, and that creates an incentive for groups to attempt to capture these resources and taking control of them, leading to conflict. So a key organizing principle. The second one that we often look at and talk about is around resource scarcity, and recognizing that when there's a physical scarcity or lack of governance or distribution factors, good management, that conflicts often emerge that's tied to local demand for these scarce resources. And the third factor that we very often talk about as a pathway to conflict is the one that we have been talking about a little bit more, which is resource curse, which is recognizing that when there's an undiversified exports and political fragility with a huge dependence on a natural resource, that it creates a situation that can very often lead to conflict. So very often when we look at these connections, we very often would note that we are not looking at a direct causal relationship between these variables. Very often we talk about intervening variables, and Patricia has talked about this primarily in terms of governance, which is very important and is always one of the important elements that we talk about. The other element that I liked in Patricia's book and in the presentation, and linking it to indigenous populations, is the question of human rights and how this comes in. And very often in the literature and in the research, this is couched in terms of the resource scarcity and resource curse paradigms. And recent reviews have looked at these issues, and then there's a list of a number of issues that come up. It's the human health damage from pollution and climate change, which you talked about, the common connection between oil interests and revenues with public and private sector corruption, a lack of transparency and accountability, violation and abuse of indigenous peoples' rights, militarization and violent conflict, organized crime, and damage to community development. So a lot of these issues come together and are very often talked about in the context of a resource curse and making the link to human rights. So very, very important framing overall in terms of how we get a sense of how these issues are linked. So what does this tell us about the inverse relationship and some of the ways that natural resources have an impact on conflict? We generally look at these in terms of direct impacts, indirect impacts, and institutional impacts. And firstly, directly, we recognize that conflict can cause physical destruction of ecosystems and wildlife through the release of pollutants and hazardous substances. So there's a direct impact on the environment, a physical impact on the environment from conflict. Indirectly, we very often look at local and displaced populations who may adopt coping strategies that may be detrimental to the natural environment in order to survive the socioeconomic disruption and the loss of basic services. So there are adaptation strategies that communities are using to deal with the situation, but may have an indirect impact on the environment. And then institutional impacts, that conflicts may cause a disruption of state institutions, initiatives, and mechanisms for policy coordination, which in turn create problems around how this conflict is managed. So it's also important to recognize that there's this inverse relationship. So Jeff Colgan, in his research, also took this to another level and looked at petro-states and got a sense of what it meant in terms of leadership and revolutionary leaders. And what he found was that revolutions tend to produce risk-tolerant leaders who have revisionist preferences, and these revolutionary leaders, therefore, are more willing to gamble on wars. So very interesting in terms of a foreign policy stance. And I think you touched on this when you talked about the definition of oil in terms of national interest and what that means. So very, very important. And then very often leading to political upheaval. And finally, to talk about how natural resources can concretely contribute to peace building. And I hope this is part of what you will explore in your work in East Africa. Overall, we see that there are three general areas that natural resources can contribute to peace building through a support for economic recovery. That recognizing that high-value resources hold out the prospect of positive economic development, employment, and budget revenue. So trying to capitalize on that and build on that. Secondly, that there are opportunities around developing sustainable livelihoods. And this is an area that's emerging more and more today in the context of a lot of projects that are looking at the linkages between natural resource management, conflict, and resilience. And as we know, that's a very popular word right now. And here at the Wilson Center, we've been trying to deconstruct and understand what that means at a community level, at a programmatic level, and at a policy level. But that we see that there are very strong ties to that work and the development of sustainable livelihoods, and very much tied to natural resource management and conflict. So that is an emerging and exciting field, forward-looking. And then finally, thinking of what this means for dialogue, cooperation, and confidence building around shared natural resource management, shared management of water, land, forest, wildlife, protected areas, and how this fits in to mining and oil extraction. So generally, what I liked about what Patricia has laid out in the book, it seems to be a really good complement to what's happening on the broader scale and how many of the organizations internationally, including UN agencies, studies are looking at peace building and what it means in terms of natural resource management. So this is an exciting opportunity to be discussing these issues.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm really impressed with this turnout on a university campus. To get a turnout like this on a Friday morning would be like, pulling teeth. So congratulations to all of you for coming here today. And it's a testament to your book, Patricia, that you've drawn such a crowd. On the surface, I'm probably an odd person to be on this panel. Someone who works in the Caribbean, someone who works a lot on Haiti. In the Caribbean, a place where indigenous populations have been the talk of history for the past 400 years. But I'll let you in on a secret. Patricia and I have a very special relationship, not that kind, but not only were we together at the USIP sequentially as Jennings Randolph's fellows, but when I was teaching a course at Howard University on the geopolitics of oil, a course which I taught at Howard, Trinity, and at one point NYU, I had invited Patricia to come and speak with my class. We had been focusing a lot on the issue of oil coming out of the Niger Basin and Delta in Nigeria, and the conflict there surrounding the group MEND, the movement for the emancipation of the Niger Delta. And I thought at this time especially the Ecuador case was quite in the news with the film and so on. And I invited Patricia to come and speak with my class and tell us a little bit about the conflict situation in Ecuador. And what we saw immediately was several commonalities between these two places. One, that the resource benefits were bypassing those who pay the highest price for their extraction. Another one was that the geopolitical isolation of marginal peoples contributed to this in both places. And we also saw in both places the limited presence of the state, which then reinforced the isolation and marginalization of the populations. And we saw conflict in both places. And I don't know if any of you recall, but Sebastian Unger had done some marvelous work on the conflict in MEND at that time. And this was exactly the time when Patricia came along to make these parallels. Now, I'm actually a geographer by academic training, and I want to bring a couple of geographic kind of insights into this discussion today. One of them is that I tend to view the world in many ways as these kind of global struggles that are related to access to and control over precious resources. Now, in the case of oil, and Patricia alluded to this in her comments, the low-hanging fruit has mostly been harvested. It's no longer the case of just sticking a needle into the ground and the oil pops up. We are now, I think, in an era that is, I would characterize as that of extreme oil. And the Western Amazon is a case of a place where you have to go to some extreme lengths to extract the resource. But there are other places like this. And I think one of the real contributions of Patricia's book is that what she has found and analyzed in the Western Amazon can be applied in many other contexts of extreme oil. Let me just mention a few of them. We have various conflict zones. Now, of course, Patricia has focused on Colombia. But, let's just think of the Caspian Sea oil and the issues surrounding the BTC pipeline, for example, and the potential conflict there. And she talked about pipeline spills and attacks in Colombia. And we have these same issues in other places where oil has to be transported over conflict areas. We have the issues of inhospitable climates. Now, I would not characterize the Western Amazon as inhospitable, but I would characterize the Alaskan North Slope, Siberia, and probably in our lifetimes, the North Pole as inhospitable climates, sorry. But also inaccessible areas. I mean, these are inaccessible areas, but we can add to that offshore drilling in deep water. And we've got, of course, the Gulf of Mexico, but we have Brazil. Do you notice there's a pattern here? Many of these examples are in the Western Hemisphere. Environmental fragility, areas of environmental fragility. Now, of course, the attacks on pipelines in Colombia and the spillage of oil there, which I once heard an Assistant Secretary of State say that there's been more oil spilled out of pipelines in Colombia than was spilled out of the Exxon Valdez. And you can imagine the environmental damage that this creates. And we look today in North America at issues of the tar sands and the pipelines transporting those oils. And we look at the rush to fracking. And these are environmental issues. And I would venture to guess that many of the American communities that are now contesting fracking in their backyard would probably find Patricia's book very useful to read. So all of these kind of have manifestations in the Western Hemisphere, and I think for that reason, Patricia's book offers policymakers, advocates, or opponents, and most importantly, peoples, indigenous or not, who are engaged in these issues, all some sort of guidance on how they might be thinking, how they might be organizing themselves, and how they might be improving upon what's been done in the past to avoid conflict. I was going to talk a little bit about the structural issues that you pointed out, but I'll pass on that because you pointed them out. But I was particularly interested in what you called in your book the transient triggers of local conflict, and how I think, again, your analysis of that offers guidelines and lessons learned that can be applied to these other extreme cases, and non-extreme cases as well, of extraction and transportation. Because it's not just extraction. It's getting the resource to its point of delivery that also is a source of conflict. I was very interested in your assessment of the civil society engagement and what in the book you call the radical NGOs. Maybe you've modulated that a little bit to, what is it again here? The combative, yeah. So maybe they're now combative and not radical. I was a little interested in that. And quite interested in the work that you outlined on the Peru Ombudsman's Office. I mean, it comes at a time when, if I could kind of go tangentially to Haiti, that the Catholic Church has once again entered into the fray to be the very important role of political mediator. And you need these kind of external mediation devices, which is really important. One point that really struck me as I read the book is this issue of the importance to listen to the voices of the voiceless people. And this did remind me very much of issues in Haiti and more generally in international development. Your examination of how the voices of those most deeply impacted by an external intervention, and in this case indigenous people, as a rule are not heard. They are not involved in the initiation of the process and have little or no voice in the planning process. And they are generally handed some sort of a fait accompli, either by the development agency, a company, or a government agency. I mean, this was very clear to me. Coincidentally, I have students reading this semester a book that turns out to be a wonderful companion to yours. I'll just hold it up here. It really is a book. It's called The Time to Listen. And the subtitle is Hearing People on the Receiving End of International Aid. And this book is very highly critical from 6,000 interviews of people around the world. It examines the flaws of a delivery system of approach to international development, the over-proceduralization, they call it, of development by those with the funds, that these procedures are often ignorant or neglectful of local context, and not to mention the local people and their organizations. And also I was struck by the oil company approach that you outline in your book, which reminds me of something that in the development world several years ago was called the QIP, the QIP, the Quick Impact Project. So basically you go out there and build something and you get a real short result, but there's no sustainability whatsoever. And this is exactly what we're seeing in the cases that you have pointed out in your book. So let me just conclude, and I know we want to get into, you all have questions you want to pose to Patricia, so let me conclude quickly that as I read the book, I found myself wondering what you were thinking regarding several important developments that have emerged or become important since you completed your writing. And I just point out 3 of them. One would be the apparent diminution or marginalization of international LNG markets with the advent of fracking. The U.S. was talking about building importation facilities for LNG, and now these facilities are being thought of for exportation. So how does this affect Peru, for example, and these communities? I was wondering about your thoughts on the withdrawal of Ecuador from the proposal to refrain from exploiting oil in the Asuni Park, following the failure of the $350 million annual payment requested by the Ecuadorian government to keep that oil buried underground. And what struck me, and this is probably right about the time I received your book in the mail to read, was this decision by a U.S. district court recently of the process by which Chevron was fined $19 million in the Ecuadorian case that was marred due to a process laden with fraud and corruption in favor of the plaintiffs of the case. Now, it was interesting that the judge did not dispute the environmental damages or the pollution, but left unsaid is unknown what the impact of this judicial ruling, which was characterized in the New York Times as a big victory for Chevron, on the ultimate settlement in Ecuador, the outcome of other potential cases, and the approach by oil companies, especially those junior or smaller companies you write of, who will no doubt in an age of extreme oil continue staking their claims to precious resources that are underneath the feet of vulnerable and isolated groups of people. So perhaps these are seeds for further writing, Patricia. And I would just make one last comment. I really loved the maps that you showed us today. I wish you would have included them in the book. As a geographer, maps is my mother's milk. So thank you very much.
Great. Wonderful. Well, thanks to all the commentators and also to Patricia for a very rich discussion. We would like to welcome your comments and questions. Please wait for a microphone. Catherine Moffat, our intern, is passing them around. We thank her for all of her work for the Latin American program. Also, Angela Badzinski there on the other side. So please raise your hand and let us know who you are as you ask a question. And if people are being timid, I'll put one out there. We'll take a couple at the beginning and then come back to our panel. It's hard for me to imagine that there would ever be a mining or oil and gas investment that has zero environmental impact, that has zero impact on the local community. So let's just say, from the perspective of environmental preservation, what can be done to what is essentially, you could see it as a zero-sum kind of transaction. Even in governments that care about those things, progressive governments that try to take these issues into consideration, how is it possible, to move forward with these kinds of investments that have been so lucrative and have financed so many laudable social programs, and still, care about and preserve the environment? So I'd like to, have people address, that basic tension. And it goes, I think the same issue goes for some infrastructure projects, hydroelectric dams. If we think that renewable energy is something that's important to have in a country like Brazil, as opposed to just burning fossil fuels, there are trade-offs. So how do those get managed? And there are going to be losers. And so how do you what is your research indicated for how to kind of mitigate the impact on vulnerable populations? I'm going to take, there was a hand over here. Let's take this, and in the back, and then Hector. Yeah.
Hi.
It's on.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
So my name is Julie Crimmins. I'm here from Ketchum. I just want to thank you all for all of your comments. It's been very interesting to hear what you have to say. And I'm interested particularly from a policy perspective, in addition to the organizations that you all represent, who you all see as the major influences, particularly in Washington in this space, and talking about conflicts around natural resources, particularly oil. Does that make sense?
Sure. Okay. In the back, right here.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
This is pretty soft. I'm John Pielemeyer. I've spent a number of years working in Brazil and a few years in the Andean Amazon with the AID programs. It strikes me that you could have substituted several terms for oil and gas and still be the same in the region. Timber, gold, sapphires, and I think Peru is probably the worst case example. There was a book by a former Inter-American Development Bank environment officer, now a Peruvian living retired in Peru, a couple of years ago, where he pointed out there's no development plan at all for Peru, and certainly nothing for the eastern part of Peru. And there were probably something like 30 proposals for highways, a dozen railroad projects, and several hidrovias, waterways, mostly financed by the Brazilian National Development Bank, or would be financed by them, that were being considered by different entities of the Peruvian government and by private investors. It strikes me that we've got a Wild West kind of a situation with a variety of extracting industries of different types converging and causing, I think, really massive damage environmentally to the region and to many of the indigenous populaces. And so it's a much broader issue, I think, than simply oil and gas, although that may be the one that brings the most money to the whole region and to the countries.
Okay, sure. Hector, over here.
Thank you very much. I'm Hector Luisi. I wonder whether, pegging off something Professor McGuire said that caught my attention, whether you could put the experience of Latin America in a global context. I'm interested to know whether you've done research as to violent deaths in the Middle East. I'm interested to know about how we in Latin America fare compared to Indonesia, for example, how many deaths there have been there, violent deaths in Indonesia compared to Peru or Colombia or Ecuador. Pipelines, was there a consulta previa in Oklahoma, where there are indigenous people who are very, not funny.
No, I agree.
It's, these are people who are very poor, so I'm just interested in context. And one comment, as a taxpayer in Montevideo and in Maryland, governments of advanced countries like this one and semi-advanced like Uruguay love building stadiums with taxpayer money.
Right. Okay. Maybe we'll take one more back here, and then we'll come back to our panel.
Todd Walters with the Center for Environment and Peace at Conservation International. I'm particularly interested in the Peru-Ecuador border and the Cordillera del Condor International Peace Park, which was established in the late 90s, and in particular with the idea of state schizophrenia and the dynamics of the changing of the borders of protected areas to allow for the resource extraction. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the dynamics of this case on the local level in that particular region.
Great. Patricia, why don't we turn back to you first?
Okay. On the issue of what Cindy, you mentioned, where do we go from here? I agree that from my perspective, there is no oil or gas development or natural resource development in general with a zero impact. So knowing that, we're well in advance to be able to take action, because we already know that there is going to be conflict. I am now, like you mentioned at the beginning, starting to do work related to these issues in Eastern Africa. There are the preliminary steps there in some countries of the development of an oil and gas industry. In the areas where the oil and gas will be developed, production has not started yet, there's all sorts of conflicts that are not related to oil and gas. There's lands issues, there's ethnic issues, there's conflicts with pastoralism, you name it. So it's a bit of common sense, that once oil arrives there, those conflicts are going to be exacerbated. Plus, oil is going to add a new dimension to it. So what do we do from here? We start by recognizing that conflicts there are going to be inevitable. we must study the context. We have to have, sometimes companies and governments make a mistake of not having a clear understanding of the dynamics, of the cultural dynamics, of the ethnic dynamics, of the government institutional dynamics, of the governance weaknesses. Once we have all this picture, then we can apply conflict mitigation mechanisms for that particular area that may be extrapolated somewhere else, but you need to study that area in particular because that area has its specific dynamics. So that needs to be done way at the beginning, way before the oil revenues start to flow. If that mechanism, those conflict mitigation mechanisms are not in place from the beginning, once the revenue starts to flow, it's too late. It's too late because all the rivalries and the conflicts that were there before are going to start to fight around the access to those revenues. In many cases, what I think is a very good starting point is transparency and communication. What happens in Africa, where I'm working now, is total lack of communication. People don't know what's happening in their communities. What happens in Latin America, in the countries that I looked at, there is communication, but it's not an organized way of communicating to people. It's the company that tells people what's going to happen with the oil project, how it's going to affect them, why they're there, while there's a rig in the backyard. Or it's sometimes the local government, but not always. It's the ombudsman in the case of Peru. There isn't a coordinated way of transmitting, and people need to know. People need to know because it's the way that they're going to be. They need to become partly owners of that project that will eventually give them some economic benefits, because we're not against the projects. These projects are going to bring them economic benefits. We just need to be able to bring them into the region with inclusion, by including these communities. And consultation in this case is fundamental. It's just that consultation is a very political issue, and I think that you brought up very good points about the flaws with the consultation, and that was the way the ILO 169 was developed. It was so political that they left it so wishy-washy that now everybody understands whatever they want about consultation. And this is we're going to come back to that, and until this is going to be, I think, hopefully, after many conflicts and problems, it's going to be revisited. It will have to. Because it has to be consultation, but it has to be improved. The process has to be improved. I have, on your question about comparisons, I think that maybe Chris is more in a better position, because I haven't worked, I just worked in Latin America, and I'm just starting to work in East Africa. And the comparisons, like I said, with the consultation there are, at least in East Africa, where they're just beginning to develop oil. This is not Nigeria, where they're well in advance. These issues of consultation and inclusion of the local community are not there yet. And there are no, Latin America is much developed in that respect.
Violent deaths?
Oh, of course.
How many do we have compared to them? Most
Well,
important than anything else.
I am looking at East Africa, where, like I said, they just started. The violent deaths were there before the oil arrived. So it is very difficult to see what is the cause and effect once the oil arrives. In Latin America, we can see some very clear patterns of conflicts increasing when the natural resource developments arrive. So, in my view, and I don't know, maybe someone else has better ideas about other parts of the world. But in my view, Latin America has well advanced. Is in a much better position in a lot of issues. The issue of consultation is imperfect, but it's there. The inclusion of indigenous populations, we have a long way to go, but there's much that has been done through national efforts, through international efforts, inter-American efforts. Peru has done, I think, revenue management of these resources is an issue. Peru has done a very good, and I think the best in the region, decentralization process. It has glitches. The money doesn't always get to the regions. The money is not always well invested, but you can follow online how the money is going from the central government to the local governments. So Latin America is there. The concepts are there. We just need to improve them. And going back to what I said in my book, unfortunately or fortunately, a lot of these improvements will take political decisions.
Yes, anybody else?
Yeah, quickly. First of all, on your point, Cindy, you're right. Any sort of natural resource extraction project is going to have an environmental consequence. And I think you have to begin with that assumption. I think that means several things. First, I think that the idea of consultation, and the problem with consulta previa is sort of the name too. It's previous informed consent. It should be consulta constante. Should always be consulting. So there's also that. And that requires, but it requires information too. And that's one of the problems here is companies have a real advantage when it comes to information. They can hire the best environmentalists to tell the community whatever they want, and the community's like, we don't know. They have to sort of take it on faith. Or they can be manipulated, which is often the case as well. So the question is and I think could be a boom industry in Latin America and actually establishing pro bono environmental lawyers who can do this stuff for community. Because there is, whether the information they're provided with is real or not, there is a very fundamental lack of trust there. Which is one of the issues that Patricia talks about related to this is, and you sort of hinted to it as well, Bob, these new areas of resource extraction are areas where states have historically not been that present. So there's that lack of trust in the state and the state's ability to serve as an interlocutor in these cases. So they're really prone to manipulation by companies or by combative NGOs, if you will, or even the best meaning NGOs. There's a whole space there for manipulation. On the issue of Julie's question about who's doing the best work here, I think the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, you mentioned this too, is taking up a lot of these cases. But this is a sea change in the way they used to do things. It means no longer taking these cases necessarily as legal cases, but actually inserted themselves in a process of mediation. And we saw the fallout when they reversed the ruling, the progress on Belo Monte in Brazil, which practically cost the commission its life.
That's right.
But it's going to really involve quite a wrenching change from what it's done, but I think it's very important that it does it. Canadians, Australians are also, if you go to these countries, they're very active in taking their model, also to your point, to these countries and trying to talk about how they've dealt with Aboriginal peoples or Native Americans in their particular context. The U.S. is not doing that as much, actually. On the issue of sort of the development plan, and I think that's absolutely right, there's a risk of sort of letting these contracts happen and not actually trying to link it to a larger national development plan and just taking the revenue, engaging, but not link it. And allowing companies often to engage in, you call it corporate social responsibility, I think more cynical would be noblesse oblige. We'll give them a school, but without linking it to a larger effort of sort of building a institutional state presence in education, for example, in a lot of these places. One case you mentioned, Peru is more advanced. And there's an interesting process right now in Peru. And it goes to your point, Cindy, about environmental damages. Is the Banking Supervisory Committee in Peru is now drafting regulations that require investors to basically insist banks to require companies to do their own consulta previa. And that's very important because companies will often say, we don't want to engage in consulta previa because all of our bondholders, our banks are breathing down our necks to get this project going. And now suddenly they're going to impose regulations that require banks to be responsible, have a fiduciary responsibility in this. I think that's very, very important because there are companies that are responsible, there are ones that are less responsible. And the other phenomenon in these places, I don't know if it happens in hydrocarbons, but in mining, are people who go in and buy the property and then they flip it. They have no intention of actually doing any large-scale extraction, but they're buying it just to sit on it and then flip it, kind of like gentrification in Brooklyn or DC. And then last, on the ILO 169, they say in Latin America that ILO 169 speaks with a Spanish accent because Latin American countries are the greatest signatories. The U.S. is not a signatory, no surprise there, because we don't sign international treaties. I know I'm sitting in an institution that's congressionally funded, so I probably shouldn't say that. But Canada hasn't signed it, Australia hasn't signed it, New Zealand hasn't signed it. It's very much an instrument. I think it's a positive thing, but it gets to a very, the very sort of unequal nature of 169. And unfortunately, yeah, we're not consulting with, and it's not just an indigenous issue. We're not consulting with poor communities who undergo fracking, or communities in Oklahoma may have a pipeline going through their backyard.
Can I add to that? And also, it's important to know that all stakeholders have a responsibility at different stages of the conflict. Sometimes at one stage it was something that the company did, and another stage it was something that the NGO did, another stage. But this is why it's very important for them to come together and to recognize their responsibility. And there's still an idea out there that it is a positive thing to have the company negotiate directly with each community on how the oil, in this case the oil funds, will be invested. If, well, okay, we'll give you a school, and that's that kind of social license that is not sustainable in the long run, because it creates a perverse relationship by which the company gets a right of way, and the community gets a school that may not have teachers, or it's not a well-designed development project that should be in place before the oil revenues arrive. But this is still very much ingrained in fact, some contracts that companies signed with governments say in the contract, okay, you're going to develop this project in this area, but you will be responsible for building a school, for building a hospital, for building that. That is not the best way of designing a development program. And I think that's a problem in itself, and that talks about the absence of the government. The government says, okay, you have the license, go deal with those people there, we're here in the capital city, we'll watch. Let us know if you have a problem, then we'll send the minister. That's how it works. I think we need to get out of that and get everybody. But for that, again, we need a political decision, I think.
Great. Bob or Roger Mark, do you have any desire to add to that?
Not a lot. I think that it's been pretty well covered here, but there's so many coulda, woulda, shouldas here, and I guess ultimately, I mean, I thought in your conclusion chapter, you touched upon some really important shoulds, but then the reinforcement of this, the pushing of it. I mean, the one question that we haven't touched, and I'm not quite sure how to touch it, is what are the major influences in this community that have something to say over these kind of conflicts, or some kind of regulation or governance of them? The Inter-American Commission, certainly. But from a U.S. perspective, frankly, I'm not sure. I thought the bifurcation you made in your analysis between the oil companies, the big majors, and the apparent lessons that they have learned, but then the miners that go in front of them and do the flipping, perhaps, and so. I mean, some approach to regularize that situation would probably go an awful long way. But again, how do you do it? How do you empower ombudsmen throughout the hemisphere to be able to have the authority to do this?
So if I could add a few quick comments. So Cindy, I was very glad that you raised the point that you did about sort of, having an environmental impact. We here at the Wilson Center released a book called Backdraft a few weeks ago that was really looking at some of these issues, looking at instances when you have very good climate mitigation and adaptation programs that have the unintended consequences of leading to conflict. And a lot of that is around the extractive industry. So here you have a well-intentioned project, a program that's being implemented, but leading to conflict. And a few weeks ago, we had a discussion here with the administrator of USAID around public-private partnerships, and this was one of the issues that we posed to him. So I want to get a little bit to your question and share with you some of the work that we have been doing with USAID's Office of Conflict Mitigation and Management, who actually is doing some very interesting analyses and producing toolkits around these areas, looking at natural resource management and conflict, and looking at how it can mainstream approaches and tools across all of the USAID missions. It's a small office within USAID, so they're trying to think about how they can mainstream this across the missions and have it as part of their process when they submit, when they have a call for proposals. So that is something that there's an attempt to institutionalize that a little bit more within the development community, recognizing that when there are conflicts, there's very often a response on the humanitarian side, so they're looking to better link these issues in the context of public-private partnerships. There are a set of principles that those of us in the peace-building community refer to and are very well accepted. And these principles are called do no harm principles. They've been very well outlined, they're very well articulated, they're a series of case studies, they've been tested in the field. And the challenge that we in this community are looking at now is how do we take these principles that are being used by funding agencies, by the development community, by the humanitarian community, and take that into the private sector investment space along the lines of public sector partnerships. So I would encourage you to also look at those principles to respond a little bit to the question that you raised, Cindy, and we are thinking about how do we move that into this space now.
Great. We have time for another round. Wow, let's take, we'll start back here and then we'll move in this direction. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is William Fulmer, and I have a question regarding the informal sector. Along with the conflicts we've seen with private companies and the government, there has seemed to be a spike in social conflicts between the government and local communities with the informal sector, often regarding logging and artisanal mining. And often these take places in areas where the central government has little presence. And even when they try to exert their presence, it often causes conflicts with those involved in the informal sector. What effective steps do you see the government that the governments should take in addressing this issue? And what do you see as a key to growth in the informal sector along with commodity demand?
Great. Really important question given the percentage of the population in the countries that we're talking about of people working in informality. Let's go right here to the middle.
Hi, my name is Althea Middleton-Detzner, and I work with International Center on Nonviolent Conflict and independently as well on research around the role of nonviolent civil resistance to hold corporations responsible for some of these effects. And I just wanted to ask a little bit about sort of the absence of the analysis of nonviolent struggles in the book. Maybe it's there and I don't know, and I'm looking forward to reading it. I think there's a lot of valuable stuff to learn from this. But I guess just in thinking about the scale that you presented on the 0 to 5, where we have no conflict or violent conflict, where is the role of nonviolent struggle in these contexts playing in terms of regulating sort of the sort of the structural flaws that we're seeing? And I'll just give an example. You talk a lot about the protests and blockades, and you're talking about nonviolent methods, but you're characterizing them as being violent without looking at where that violence is coming from. Is it coming from the state or security forces, or from the actors, the community members themselves? And so I just wonder if you could kind of like add that layer into thinking about a lot of the issues that you've brought up today. And thanks very much.
Okay. Let's continue around the table. Let's take this and then one more right here.
Hi, my name is Ilona Coyle, and I'm with the Environmental Law Institute. And I was wondering, as you're looking at these conflicts and characterizing them as escalating, have you seen that they reach a turning point where they start to de-escalate? And what tends to cause that? Are there particular actors or particular dynamics that change to cause these conflicts to de-escalate? And and I know you talked about the ombudsman, but are there other tools? Are there other mechanisms? Are there other people who are getting involved or changing their behavior in a way that helps to mitigate these conflicts?
Maybe you could pass down here to this side. Right there.
Thank you. Lena Carlino from the State Department. My question is related to conflict related to remediation efforts associated with extractive industries, whether that's mining, gas, or oil, and specifically, is there a role for community engagement at that phase in reducing conflict?
Okay. Patricia, do you want to start?
Yes.
And this will be our final round. So anything you have left to say, please do it now.
I'll start from the last question. I think if there's a role for community engagement, of course there's a role, but a lot of times, very often what happens is that communities need to be informed about what's going on. They need to be maybe. I don't like to use the word capacity building because I don't know. I just don't. I have a problem with that. But they need some help in maybe trying to find a common decision, a common view about the oil or gas project that is going to take place in their territory. For that, the civil society is fundamental. But what happens a lot of times is that the civil society is fragmented or is not there or doesn't know the issues. So there's a previous work that needs to be done with the civil society. And I think that it's through the civil society that community engagement throughout the whole project, not just at the beginning or in the middle or at the end, throughout the whole project, that it could be done. Also, I spoke about the ombudsman, and that goes also to the other question. And I think that in this case, I looked at the example of the ombudsman in Peru that could also play that role. An institution like that, it doesn't have to be exactly in the same structure as the one in Peru. It could be a well-known, well-respected personality in the society, for example, that people trust, that people look up to. And that person could try to bring, try to engage the community and engage the stakeholders and bring the message of the oil or gas development to the community in a way that the communities will believe it because they trust that person. So I use the ombudsman as an example of something that could be copied, or some ideas could be extracted from that, the way that institution worked, and then applied elsewhere. I think that in terms of applying de-escalation and how to de-escalate the conflict, someone asked this question. Grievance mechanisms should be in place from the very beginning and not just organized by the oil company, because the oil company in the end does not have as much credibility. It's the oil company that is coming. It's not among the community. They need other institutions, someone else that has more credibility. And I would tell you, it's sometimes even the central government that would have more credibility than the oil company, because for the communities, it's the central government that represents them. As much as there is a lot of mistrust and a lot of comings and goings with the central government, in the end, at the end of the day, that's who they want there to listen to their grievances. So the grievance mechanisms should be there from the beginning. The information, fundamental transparency and information should be there throughout the whole process. The consulta, and I agree with Chris, not just previa, but consulta throughout. We should change the name of that.
Great.
And the way the consulta is done should be discussed with the local people, because it's not just a one-time. Normally, in a lot of places, it comes down to sitting down with the community at the time of presenting the environmental impact assessment, informing them in the 3 or 4 meetings that they have about this project, and then that's it. For many people, that is not consulta. So let's see what it means, consulta, for these people. Because if not, you're going to have a conflict, because they are going to feel that they were not asked. And of course, the issue that they don't have a veto power, but that's another issue that goes beyond. Then another question, I think I answered 2 or 3 questions at the same time here. Yes. No, did I leave anything? I think I answered more or less.
Informal sector.
Yes, bringing in the informal sector. I think that the way that the informal sector has to be brought in, it has to be formalized. I mean, that's and there are examples of that in Latin America and elsewhere, because it makes no sense to go against the tide. So they need to be. You need to study why it's informal. What are those people needing, and then trying to bring them into the formal sector, and then you practically solve the problem.
Quickly, on the question, I guess, Ilona, the de-escalation, I want to second Patricia's comments. It is listening, most of all, and building in a consensus-based monitoring and evaluation plan from the start. And that is key. And just the mere act, I don't want to minimalize it or cheapen it, but the mere act of talking is important. But it's talking also with time. You hear this time and time again, is that many indigenous communities have a different concept of time, and they don't want to be rushed. And so this idea that, again, investors are breathing down the necks of mining or oil companies or whatever doesn't sit well with them. They just have a different, and so that has to be done con calma. And that's very, very important. So I'd say that's one. On the issue of the informal sector, it's an important, I think very important issue for a number of reasons. First of all, artisanal, informal, or illegal mining is often the most polluting and also the most corrupting. It is the greatest threat of all the sort of, you think about the range of polluting sites, and those would be the worst. Santos, the president of Colombia, has actually undergone he's now trying to give title to informal miners, but he said informal miners, yes, or informal projects, yes, illegal, no, which is, because some of them are linked, obviously, in the case of Colombia, to paramilitaries or guerrillas. So I think it's easier said than done, but I think it's an effort to try to bring them in, and when you do that, you can regulate them. In Peru, it's a little more difficult because there's actually a very strong construction sector and a number of politicians who are tied to the informal mining and extractive industry. And there have been efforts to regulate it that have been beaten back by a number of senators in Peru who are tied to it. And so I wish there were, artisanal. I'm in Brooklyn, so everything now is artisanal, cheese, bread. I wish we'd have like artisanal copper and just sort of set up a farmer's market and just sort of convert them over that way, but it's easier said than done. But it is a huge issue.
Bob, any last comment?
Done.
Good, Roger. Great. All right, please join me in thanking Patricia for her work and all of our commentators for all of it. Okay, now with a little help from FedEx or UPS, the books will be out there, so bring out your checkbooks and your credit cards. Thank you.
Really is a great book.
Thank you very much.
Really is a good book. Really, I was envious. If anything, I sort of had to
Good group,
curb my own envy. Yes, sign mine. Yes, sign mine.
Can you send me her presentation?
We'll put it up on the web, and you guys, and we can both have it on